You will remember, those of us who were blessed to be here on Friday night, that Father Peter Girard spoke to us on Friday about accepting the cross. Yesterday, why St. Dominic wept, the holiness of the Mass. And he continues a theme that was referred to by a couple of speakers earlier in the day, and that is our cross day by day. And please God, he will make it clearer to me what I'm supposed to do about that. Father Peter Girard.
And now if you'll join with me in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, for our final reflection on the mystery of the cross and accepting our cross day by day, I'm going to take you for a moment back in time, back to the book of Job in the Old Testament. Now, Job was a man in despair. Listen to a few words of what Job says. My days have come to an end without hope. I shall not see happiness again. Perhaps we do not fully appreciate just how much Job had lost. The book of Job, the most poetically told story of the wisdom literature, tells us that Job was an upright and honest man. He followed the commandments. He was loving towards his wife and his children. He was generous to his neighbors. Job was the wealthiest merchant of the land of Uz, which is just south of the Dead Sea, present-day southern Jordan and southern Israel. And yet, in an instant, everything was taken away from him. Job, the Bible tells us, had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 oxen, 500 donkeys, with enough servants to take care of them all. Job had 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, all of whom were grown by the time the story is told in Job. Now, one night, a messenger came knocking at the door with some bad news. Marauders from rival tribes had stolen all of his livestock and murdered his servants. His business was gone in a single night of murder and mayhem. And later that night, another messenger came with the most terrible news of all. All of Job's children were at the house of the eldest boy for a celebratory dinner. A powerful windstorm had collapsed the roof of the house, and all of Job's children were killed. And that is not even all. Shortly after this horrible night, Job was afflicted with a terrible skin disease. Now, from the descriptions in the Bible, the illness was probably lymphatic filariasis. It's more commonly called elephantiasis. It's a disorder of the lymphatic system spread by mosquitoes. There are still about 117 million people afflicted with this disease today. The inflammation of the lymphatic system causes extreme and disproportionate enlargement of the limbs, of the head, of the torso. This meant that Job would have been progressively disfigured and considered unclean according to Jewish law. He would have had to move outside of the city limits and kept his distance from anyone approaching him. And now we can see why Job was a man in despair. Such terrible hardship had afflicted him and his family. Yesterday, Secretary Nicholson spoke of the many hardships in his family growing up. Job experienced these similar hardships. Now, in the book of Job, his friends and relatives arrive to give the traditional explanations of why Job was suffering, traditional explanations from their theological heritage. And these explanations ranged from, you or your parents must have committed some sin, that's why you're suffering. Or they told him, God only rewards people in the next life, not in this one, so simply suffer through this life and you will get a reward later. Another explanation was, demons are simply chasing after you. There's not too much you can do about it. Or the final explanation he was given was, there is no meaning to your suffering. Curse God and die. That's the end. Now, Job was not satisfied with any of these answers. At the end of the book of Job, God himself appears to him. And you might think that Job would finally get an answer from the creator and redeemer of the universe. But Job does not get a clear answer. God tells Job, there is an answer to the meaning of human suffering, but I cannot tell it to you now. And that is how the book of Job ends. God knows the answer to the meaning of human suffering, but we are not able to know what it is. Now, if all we would read would be the book of Job and nothing else, we would fall into despair as well. And yet the good news, my friends, is that God would not stay silent on this question forever. The Lord did not reveal the meaning of human suffering to Job because the answer was to be spoken in the fullness of time, according to God's plan. God the Father spoke the answer to human suffering in the incarnation of his Son. Jesus is the answer to the meaning of all human suffering. We see this in the Gospels. To every person that extends their hands or themselves to Jesus, Jesus alleviates them of their illness and their suffering. There is no darkness, there is no illness, there is no loneliness, there is no sorrow, there is no tragedy that is beyond the healing touch of his crucified and glorious hands. So, my friends, you see, it is not as if God never answered Job. He answered Job in the person of Christ. Friends, God does not desire that we suffer. He is not bloodthirsty. He does not punish you for your sins by giving you cancer or by taking away someone that you love. Those were the answers that Job's friends were trying to give. Suffering happens because we live in a world damaged by original sin and from the bad decisions human beings make every day. The secret to human suffering, revealed in Christ, is this: there is no suffering that is beyond the healing power of his grace, poured forth from his sacred wounds. Jesus has the power to touch every suffering we endure in order to transform it to be a source of grace for us. And he desires to touch each one of our wounds. Friends, this is why there is no place for despair in the Christian life. There is a difference between sadness and despair. Sadness we all encounter in life because of loss. Sadness is expected and normal. Despair, however, is never called for in the Christian life. This is when we doubt that the Lord will give us his graces. He will always give us the graces that we need according to his plan of salvation for us. And so whatever suffering we may endure, no matter how horrible the tragedy we may suffer, all we need do is turn to Jesus. He will never fail to touch our wounds with his own crucified and glorious hands. So each suffering we endure, friends, is actually an opportunity to grow in grace. Now, we can either turn to Jesus and ask for his healing touch, or we can turn away and allow our wounds to destroy us. It's up to you. You can allow life sufferings to consume you and destroy you, or you can turn them over to Jesus. He desires so much to touch each of our wounds, even if they happened many, many years ago. For many years, I worked in Mother Teresa's homes for people with AIDS, both in Washington, D.C. and in New York City, and also for the Hawthorne Dominican Sisters hospices for people with incurable cancer. And walking through these homes for the terminally ill, I saw people that turned their wounds over to Christ, and I saw people who were refusing to turn their wounds over to Christ. The people who refused to turn over their sufferings, refused to allow the Lord's crucified and glorious hands to touch them, these were the people who were in despair. These were the people dying in bitterness and anger. And yet those who turned their sufferings over to the crucified and glorious risen Christ, these were the people, even in the midst of their suffering, were dying a death of saints, dying joyfully because they had allowed their wounds to be transformed. Let me mention to you someone in the Scriptures who allowed their wounds to be touched by the hands of Christ. You all know the woman with the abnormal hemorrhage in the Gospels, the woman who went up to the Lord and said, "If I can just touch the tassel of his garment, I will be made well." You may remember that this is a healing on the way to another healing. The Lord was on his way to heal the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue official. And there was a large crowd of people all around the Lord. And on his way to heal the synagogue leader's daughter, this woman with the abnormal hemorrhage, sees him and wants to go touch the tassel of his garment. Now, this woman was suffering greatly. According to Jewish law, anyone who was considered unclean was ostracized from the community. A woman with an abnormal hemorrhage of blood was considered unclean according to Jewish law. And these laws were very strict and enforced by the community. For such a woman who had this condition, she herself was considered unclean, and no one was allowed to touch her. If anyone were to touch her, or she were to touch anyone, that other person would also be unclean. Any physical object she touched would become unclean. So if she touched this podium, the podium would become unclean. The laws were so strict that anyone who touched anything she touched would be considered unclean. So if she sat in a chair, no one else could sit in that chair. Such a woman, under Jewish law, would have had to move outside of the city limits like Job, and even her family could not approach her. The only way she could be made clean again, according to Jewish law, was to wait for the Lord to heal her. Only God could heal her of her illness. And when she was healed, she would go to the temple in Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice for her sins. She would bring an animal to the altar of sacrifice in the Jewish temple. Now, in the Jewish temple, there in front of the Holy of Holies, there was a stone altar, exactly square. The stone altar had a horn on each corner. It was called the four horns of the altar. And after she was healed, she would go to the temple, go to the altar. The Jewish priest would take this animal she offered for sacrifice. He would sacrifice that animal, pour out its blood upon the altar, and he would take some of the blood of this animal and touch it to the four corners of the altar. And when he touched the blood to the four corners of the altar, she was made clean again. She could rejoin her family and the community. Now, the Gospels reveal to us just how long this woman had this condition. It said that she had the condition for over 12 years. For over 12 years she was living in this state. She would have missed the raising of her own children. Now, this woman knew the law as well as anyone else. In fact, the gospel tells us that she had spent all of her savings on doctors of every sort. That probably means she had to go to Samaritan doctors. A Jewish doctor would not touch her. She was unclean. And so for 12 years, she is living as a recluse, away from the community, away from her husband, her children. And yet, when she sees the Lord walking down her street, knowing full well the Jewish law, she sees him and says, I must touch the tassel of his garment, and I will be made well. It is significant she mentions the tassel of his garment. Do you know this is one of only two places where it is described how the Lord is dressed, what he is wearing? Approaching the Via Dolorosa, his crucifixion, he is described wearing a purple cloak. And here, he is described wearing a vestment with tassels. That's very specific in Jewish law. In the time when the Lord walked the earth, all Jewish observant males, after his bar mitzvah, wore a poncho type of vestment. It was a square piece of cloth with a hole in the middle. He wore it over his head, so it hung down over his main tunic. And on each corner were tassels. Have you seen Jewish men today wearing a prayer shawl? That is the descendant of what they used to wear. They used to wear this poncho vestment with the tassels. 4 tassels. Each tassel had 635 knots. It was to represent every precept of the Torah they were to observe. These were observant Jewish men who wore this vestment. Now, why did they wear this vestment? It was to remind them of that square altar in the temple in Jerusalem, that altar upon which their sins would be forgiven by the outpouring of blood. The square altar with the 4 horns, the square vestment with the 4 tassels, the precepts of the Torah. Can you see who the Lord is revealing himself as he walks through that town wearing that poncho vestment with the 4 tassels? He is revealing himself as the true altar of sacrifice. You see, that altar built in the temple was simply a prefigurement, built to prefigure the Lord himself, who is the true altar of sacrifice. It is his own blood poured out upon the altar of his body that is the true forgiveness of sins. And so this woman with the hemorrhage, because she is saying yes to this gift of faith, she sees the Lord for who he truly is. In an instant, she knows, I do not have to go to the temple in Jerusalem anymore to be made clean. Why? The true temple is here. The true altar of sacrifice is here. Now all I need to do is touch him, and I will be made clean again. And so she goes up to the Lord in fear and trembling, Remember, people would be very suspicious to see her. She was not supposed to touch anyone. And here actually is one of the only places, it is the only place, where it is recorded where the apostles are actually sarcastic with the Lord. That is, a big crowd of people are rushing around the Lord. They're all touching him all around, many hundreds of people. And when this woman with the hemorrhage comes up behind, she just touches the tassel of the garment, like the blood outpoured in the Old Testament by way of prefigurement. The gospel tells us power goes out from the Lord, healing power through the tassels. And she is completely made clean, physically, spiritually, made whole again. And the Lord's aware of this. He says, someone touched me. And that's when the apostles get sarcastic. Everyone's touching him. They say, what do you mean, who touched me? Everyone's touching you. But the Lord says, no. Someone really touched me. One person only truly touched me in this crowd, because only one person has seen me for who I truly am. The new altar of sacrifice, upon which blood would be poured out for the forgiveness of sins for all time. This woman with the hemorrhage, suffering so greatly with these wounds for over 12 years, not being able to hug her children for 12 years, comes to the Lord for healing, and he gives her these graces because he is the true altar of sacrifice. Friends, the same thing happens to you and me. He is the true altar of sacrifice for all people. Whatever loss you have endured, whatever suffering you encounter, all we need do, like the woman in the Scriptures, is come to the Lord and touch the tassel of his garment. That is to touch his crucified and glorious wounds. And he will give us the graces of healing, according to his time and plan. Remember Psalm 40 that I told you about. I waited for the Lord, and he stooped down to me. He heard my cry. He lifted me up from the pit of destruction, and he put a new song into my mouth. So I encourage all of you here today. There is a meaning to all of your suffering. The answer is in the extended hands of the crucified Christ upon the cross. Turn your illnesses, turn your sorrows, turn your tragedies, turn your darkness over to him. He will not ignore you. Just wait for his healing hand, and it will transform you in a way that you could never have predicted. Remember the physician at Lourdes I spoke about yesterday. It will be a better healing than you could have imagined for yourself. Just trust in him. He desires to pour out this healing to you. I want to leave you at this convention by telling you about someone who can help you on your way of the cross. Someone who can help you turn your tragedies and sorrows over to Christ. It is a very special woman. It is a woman who loves you. She is a woman who stood at the cross of her own Son, and so she will stand at the foot of your cross as well. During the 1980s, scientists, geneticists, decided to embark upon an important question. They wanted to discover, by studying DNA, how many mothers must there have been at the beginning of the human race. That is, they were trying to determine, by studying the complexity of DNA, how many original female members of the human race had to exist at the beginning. How many mothers must there have been to account for all the many human beings alive today and have ever been alive, the diverse array of man. Now, scientists before the study had estimated, perhaps at some numbers. Some estimated as low as 1,000, some estimated as high as 10,000, but they figured there had to be something in that range to account for the many different human beings on earth in history. And so they engaged in this study. And they used the latest supercomputers to analyze all the data. And do you know they came to a conclusion, a definite conclusion. They were able to arrive at a number of how many original mothers must there have been at the human race. Not a single researcher had guessed the number before they began, but the number is conclusive. How many original mothers must there have been at the beginning of the human race? The answer is one. Friends, this means that science has confirmed that all human beings alive on earth today, and has ever been on earth, came from one mother. All human beings, regardless of their race, skin color, language, country of origin, all came from the womb originally of one mother. Now, perhaps unwittingly demonstrating the harmony of reason and faith, scientists gave a name to this first mother. Do you know what they call her? The mitochondrial Eve. This is because Genesis reveals to us this truth. Eve. What was she called in the Scriptures? The mother of all the living. God was so good to his creation that in the beginning he gave creation a mother, the gift of a mother, in order to nurture us. Now Eve was not to retain her title of mother of all the living. Through her disobedience and the disobedience of her husband, she lost that title of mother of all the living. Remember, I spoke about them being cast out of the garden and no longer to be able to touch the tree of life. And so Eve was no longer the mother of all the living after the fall. She became the mother of all those who would die. Now, friends, many of us think of the world as being created once, but to tell you the truth, the world has really been created twice. That is, recreated. The world was created first, Genesis, the beginning. But when was the world recreated? It was recreated through the suffering, death, and resurrection of Christ. As his blood fell to the earth, St. Paul tells us, Jesus was reconciling the world to himself, restoring it in his image. And just like at the first creation, God gave the first creation the gift of a mother. What does God give as a gift to the second creation? The restored world. The same thing, the gift of a mother. When he sees St. John, the youngest apostle, what does he say to him? In Latin, by the way, it's three very beautiful words. Ecce mater tua. John 19:26. Behold your mother. The Lord here, in fact, uses the word woman in order to identify his mother with the woman. There's only one other woman in the Scriptures called that, Eve, in Genesis. And so at that moment, Mary became the new mother of all the living, the mother of the new creation, the mother of the redeemed human race. Do you know, friends, our Blessed Mother has many titles. The Litany of Loretto, our Eastern Rite brethren, the Ukrainians and the Byzantines and the Melkites and the Maronites, they have, and all the other Eastern brethren, our Orthodox brethren, we have many, many titles of Our Lady. But do you know what the oldest title of Our Lady is? The oldest title of Our Lady, we see Christians referring to Our Lady by a special title not that long after her own assumption into heaven. Early Christians were already calling Mary, singing and praying to her, Mary, you are the new Eve, the new mother of all the living. Now, friends, Mary is not just the mother of all Catholics. She's not even just the mother of all Christians. She's the mother of all human beings, and she wants all of them to come closer to her Son. Now, since Mary is the new Eve, she is not just symbolically your mother. She is truly your mother. And so she is someone that you can turn to in times of greatest need. As the new Eve, she will never fail to help you when you call upon her. When you are on the cross yourself, when you feel you are suffering upon the cross, all you need do is turn to Mary, and she will help you turn your darkness and your sufferings over to her Son. She will help you bring your wounds to the wounds of her own crucified and yet risen Son. Friends, I learned as a young boy that Mary is a special mother that we can turn to in times of greatest need, especially when we are suffering the cross. When I was a boy, I lived in a large neighborhood, and a lot of us boys in the neighborhood would play together in a large forest that surrounded the neighborhood. Now, our parents allowed us to play in this forest, but they did have one rule. The parents got together and decided on a rule for us all. And that is, they did not want us climbing any of the trees. They were afraid if we were way out in the woods and fell from a tree, it would be too dangerous. So they told us, boys, you can play in the woods, but no climbing of the trees. Now, boys are as they are. Now, I must tell you that I never climbed the trees. But other boys, perhaps. Now, there was one tree in this forest that even we, 7, 8-year-old boys, had enough sense not to climb. It was a very tall tree, and it had died. And so it looked very menacing, very dangerous. So even we would not climb it. Not me, others. Now, there was one boy, I remember one summer afternoon, decided that he was going to prove to the rest of us that he was the bravest, he was the greatest of us all, and he would climb this forbidden tree. We warned him not to do it. We said, something terrible will happen if you climb this tree. He said, I will do it anyway. So he began to climb this tree. Now, there were a group of maybe 20 of us. I was 7 years old. I had my little brother with me. He was 4. Looking at him, climbing this tree. This boy got about 25 or so feet in the air, and then something terrible did happen. The branch that he was on snapped, and he began to fall. Now, it might have been better for this little boy if he would have just fallen straight to the ground. He might have broken an arm or a leg, but it didn't happen that way, unfortunately. On his way down, falling from this tree, his left arm got caught on one of the branches, and it tore open his left arm. He fell to the ground. We ran over to him. I could see that this branch had torn open his arm, all the way from his shoulder to his wrist. Now, this was a very large wound, a little boy's arm, maybe about that long. Now, this is a horrifying sight for anyone to see, let alone 7, 8-year-old boys. We were not sure what to do. We picked him up and ran with him back into the neighborhood. Halfway back to the neighborhood, a woman saw us. She was not the boy's mother. To this day, I do not know who she was. She saw us, grabbed the boy, took him to her automobile, and drove him to the hospital immediately. We did not know what to do. We were crying. We thought our friend might lose his arm. They may have to amputate his arm. My little brother and I walked home, tears in our faces, wondering what we could do. And I turned to my brother and said, I think maybe there's one thing we can do. We could pray to Mary and ask her to help our friend so that he would not lose his arm. And if we ask Mary, our mother, to help us, I'm sure she would be able to help us here. So we went back to our room. We shared a room. And on our bedposts were little plastic glow-in-the-dark rosaries. Now, 7 years old, I wasn't exactly sure how to pray the rosary. I knew that the small beads were Hail Marys. I knew that. But I didn't know about the larger beads. I wasn't sure about the other prayers. All I knew is the small beads were Hail Marys, and I knew how to say that. So, my brother and I knelt down at our bedside, and I wanted to see how many prayers we would have to say. So I looked at the rosary, and I counted the small beads, and I remember so clearly, there were 53 small beads. The 5 decades and the 3 Hail Marys in the beginning. 53 Hail Marys, 53 prayers. All right, so I knew we had to say 53 prayers. My brother next to me, and I spoke to Our Lady, the new Eve, for the first time in my little life. And I said, Mary, I don't know what you can do to help our friend, but you know what happened to him. So my brother and I, we're going to say these 53 prayers. We're going to say the 53 prayers. And once we say the 53 prayers, maybe you can help him. We said the 53 Hail Marys. Later that evening, my father came to me with some news from the hospital. A surgeon was able to save the boy's arm with 53 stitches. And so you can see, friends, that Mary is indeed truly our mother. She is the woman who loves you, who stands by the foot of your cross, a loving mother to whom you can always turn. My prayer for each of you here at this convention is that you will allow yourselves to be held in the loving arms of the mother who loves you, so that she can in turn present you to her Son. Never despair, friends. All of your sufferings have meaning in the sacred and glorious wounds of Christ. Ask Mary to help you, and she will help you turn all these over to Him, and you will discover that your souls will shine radiantly with His grace. His grace will transform you in ways that you could have never anticipated. Just say yes to Him. Say yes to embracing your cross day by day, and the wondrous grace pouring from those wounds of Christ will transform you most wonderfully, more wonderfully than you could ever imagine. Friends, I want to thank you for inviting me here to New Zealand. I'm actually now going to be able to spend a few days seeing your beautiful country, riding around and seeing a bit of the natural countryside, and then I will return to the States. But know that you are in my prayers, and should the Lord ever see fit to bring our paths together again, I look forward to the opportunity. If you are ever in the United States, especially in New England, where I am, come by the monastery of the Mother of God, where I live, where the nuns have perpetual adoration of Jesus in the most blessed sacrament, and I will be there to welcome you.